Okay, so if we're not going to use data annotations for validation, then what are we going to use? And what we're going to use is something called Fluent validation. And to make use of this, we're going to need a helper package. So we'll go to NuGet Gallery, and what we want to search for here is Fluent validation. And the one that we want is the Fluent validation.ASP.NET Core, and we're going to install this into our application project. This is what's going to be responsible for validating our requests. And the version at the time of recording is 9.3.0, and I'm just going to go ahead and install this. And this should go ahead and do this, and then restore this into our project so that we can now make use of it. And the way that we're going to do this is, if we open up our activities controller, then what we're passing to our create activity method, we'll just focus on this one for the time being, is an activity object. And this is what we want to validate against. And if we validate against the thing that's coming into our API, then we can take advantage of the API controller attribute, which is automatically going to add any validation errors to our model state and then automatically return the 400 request or 400 response. So this is what we're going to validate against. And the way that we're going to do this, I'm just going to go into the application activities and create handler. And what we're going to do is kind of add some almost like middleware in between our command and our handler. So inside here, we're going to say public class, and we're going to call it command validator. And we're going to derive from the abstract validator we get from Fluent validation. So we'll use the quick fix and bring in Fluent validation. And then we specify what it is we're going to validate against. And in this case, it's going to be the activity. So we give this a constructor. So I'm just going to add the quick fix or use the quick fix and say generate constructor command validator. And inside here, we can specify what rules we want to add. Now we'll say rule 4, and this takes an expression. So we can say X as our parameter, which is going to be our activity, and then we can choose which field we want to validate against. Now we're just going to say the title for the time being, and then we can specify our rules. And one that we can use as a required type of validator is to look to see if this is not empty. And in this case, validation will fail if the property is null, an empty string, white space, an empty collection, or the default value for the type. For example, this would be 0 for integers, or null for nullable integers, or null for any object. So that's the one we'll use. We'll specify not empty. And then what we can do is we can go and configure this in our startup class. So what we'll do is we'll head over to the startup class, because we need to make sure our application is aware that we're using Fluent validation. And what we can do here is, where we're saying services add controllers, we can specify that we want to add Fluent validation. And we'll get this again from Fluent validation ASP.NET Core in this case. And then we can specify that we want to give it some config. And in the config, what we really just need to do is tell it where our validators are coming from. Now, we're going to be doing the validation in our application project. So what we're going to specify here is config, and then we're going to say register validators from assembly containing. And then we can specify that we want to use something inside our application project. Now, the one that we're working on now will suffice. We're working on our create handler, and we only need to do this once for all of our handlers. As long as we specify a class that lives inside our application project, then that's the assembly that our create handler is going to be located in. So any validators that we add into that project are now going to be picked up and registered with our controllers. And I've got an error here. I'm just missing the semicolon at the end here. So what we should be able to do now is go back and test in Postman and see if we can create an empty activity. And this should fail with the same 400 bad request response that we had before. and it tells us that the title must not be empty. Okay, so far so good. But what we'll do here is, because we want the same kind of validation for our create activity as well as the edit activity, we're going to be validating against the activity either way. What we'll do is we'll create a validator purely for validating the activity. So what we'll do is we'll create a new class and we'll call it activity validator, and we'll do this inside our activities folder in the application. And once again, we're just going to derive from the abstract validator, and we're going to specify the type as the activity. And let's just go ahead and bring in Fluent validation, and we'll also need to bring in domain so that we can make use of activity. Make sure you specify domain, of course, and not system diagnostics to get our own class of the activity entity. And then we just need to create a constructor with no parameters, and then we can specify rule 4, and we'll specify the title once again. So we'll say x goes to x.title, and we're going to specify this is not empty. And then what we'll do is we'll just copy this down 5 more times, and we'll just add validators for each of the properties inside our activity. So one's going to be description, another one's going to be dates, another one's going to be category, another one will be city, and another one, or the final one, will be venue. Now we've got plenty of different options, and we can chain on different options for this as well. Supposing we wanted to make sure that this was an email address, we could do so. And there's a bunch of different rules inside here that you can take a look at. We can add matches for regular expressions. We've got maximum length, minimum length, must options, less than, all sorts of different options here. But we're going to keep things really simple and just make sure that they are not empty. So all of these fields are required. And then what we can do is we can head back to our create class, and instead of validating against the activity now, we're going to specify that we want to validate against the command, because the command class contains our activity. And then we're going to specify that we want a rule 4 activity, and we're going to specify that we're going to set the validator for this property or this object, and then inside here we're going to say new activity validator. And if we go and take a look again inside Postman, and we once again try and create an empty activity, this time we see that the validations occurred for every single property that we specified there. So we need this for both our create and our edit activity. We don't want to be able to send up activity objects with empty fields. And we'll go to our edit class, but let's just copy this into the clipboard. And we'll head to our edits, and we'll just paste in this code inside here, which is obviously identical to the create, and we'll specify Fluent validation. And this rule is now in place for the activity when we're editing or we're creating. So now we're validating our requests. Great. And we'll come back to using Fluent validation, obviously, as and when we need it, but this will suffice for the time being. What we're going to focus on next is how we handle API errors in our application.